we've got a few folks on now, so we'll kick it off because we only have an hour this week. Now, if you're coming back next week for the second end user prep session, it'll be a little bit longer. It's about an hour and a half, and we'll go into more details about the teacher guides, but we're jumping way ahead of ourselves. First, let me introduce myself in case you don't know who I am. I'm Matt Hanlon, a longtime software engineer. I worked for Apple for a long time, and it's getting longer and longer ago. I left in about 2013, 2014 to teach coding and teach others how to teach coding. And I'm really excited to be kind of back working with Apple on showing you guys some of this amazing materials that they have. The Develop in Swift curriculum that we're going to talk about today is a fantastic tool for you to use in your classroom if you're teaching students or if your students want to learn about, well, how do I build apps? So that's the purpose of today. This is the first end user prep session. I'm going to go through what that means and where that is in the whole timeline of all the things you might be working on in just a little bit. This is what today's session is going to look like. We'll have a little welcome and introductions, which we're doing right now. As I mentioned, I'd love it if you dropped a note in the chat about where you're coming from. I think we've got people from Singapore, from UAE, from all over the place. So drop a note in the chat about where it is that you teach, and even the institution if you want. So after we get through our welcome and introductions, it won't be super long. I'm going to give a little sort of overview of how this series works, the 2 end user prep sessions, and then what we call the T3. And I'll go into more detail on that in that how this course will work section. Once we've gone through that, if we have any questions, we'll definitely take them at that stage about maybe next steps for you. Hopefully we'll cover them by the time we're done with this whole hour today. Then I'm going to go into the Develop in Swift Fundamentals curriculum itself. That's going to be the key that you're going to focus on, especially if you want to become a certified trainer in app development with Swift. Once we've gone through some of the materials, and we're going to focus primarily on the student materials. So if you're teaching this material yourself, it's going to be the stuff that your students are going to work through. So it's a really good experience to take a look at all the types of things that you could assign to them and that you're going to have them read through. Towards the very end, we're going to close with what's expected for next week because there is a bit of homework. Now, it's a lot of homework. So if you decide, oh man, there's no way I can get that done before the second end user prep session next week, that's perfectly fine. If you attend the second end user prep session and you haven't done all the homework, there's no panic. It is recommended, though, that you do complete all the homework before you attend a train the trainer class, because you have to present this material back and you have to teach this material back to us. So if you haven't read it and you haven't done the labs and the quizzes, you might have a hard time getting through it. Unless you're a super experienced iOS developer, in which case maybe you'll be okay. But it definitely helps to read through the material and work through the homework. So if you feel, actually, you know what, I'd rather get all the homework done, that's cool. You can always sign up for a second end user prep session. We have another one coming up next month. So we'll have one in February. We'll have another one in March. And I'm sure we'll be scheduling more for the next quarter when we get to it. So we'll go through what's expected for next week or whenever you rejoin us for the second end user prep session. We'll have a little closing where we'll take some questions if you have any. And we'll kind of close there and see you again next week. If you do have any questions during the course of this whole spiel, feel free to drop them in the chat. I love that people are kind of dropping in where they're from. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, excellent. Never used Swift UI before, excellent. Apple Developer Academy in Saudi Arabia, very cool. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to try to gauge how much experience we have here with these materials. We're going to have a quick poll. So in the chat, just answer one of those, A, B, C, or D. Have you seen these books before? Develop in Swift Fundamentals Teacher Guide and Student Guide. You could say yes, and I teach them. Yes, and I've read them. Yes, but I haven't read them yet. Or D, no, I've never seen these before.
No, katıldım.
Excellent.
Hı hı.
Excellent. Right. So no one seems to be teaching them yet. A few people have seen them, and a couple people haven't seen them at all. This session should be good for all of you because I'm going to go into them in a little bit more depth. So even if you've read them, maybe I'll show you some extra wrinkles that you might not have considered if you're not teaching them already. Because there's so much great material here that makes it so easy for us to teach this in a classroom. Saves us a lot of time. Okay, so let's have a quick talk about the logistics. How is this course going to work? Now, this is a sample calendar. It's a random generic month. This is where we are today. So imagine today was the 4th and it was a Wednesday. This is our first end user prep session. And this is where we're going to go through all the material in Developing Swift Fundamentals from a student's point of view. What is there to teach me how to develop in Swift and be able to build apps by the time I'm done with the material? So we're going to go over that in an hour today. Now, next week, same time, for a little bit longer, we have our second end user prep session. That's an hour and a half. And in that session, we'll answer any questions you might have had about the labs or the quizzes or any of the homework you had. And we'll go through the material from a teacher's perspective. What tools are there for us to be able to teach this to our students? And the beautiful thing about it is that there's keynote slides. So if you deliver lectures in a classroom, perfect, we've got you covered. In fact, those lectures are going to be the key to becoming certified as a trainer in app development with Swift. And that's when we get to the next portion. So once we've finished that second end user prep session, you'll get an email from Claire that'll give you a link to sign up to a Train the Trainer week. Now, that is a week-long class. It goes from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. That's Irish/UK time. And to get on a Train the Trainer class, you do need to have access to a Mac because you are going to be presenting keynote slides and you're also going to be presenting demonstrations with Xcode, which of course only runs on a Mac. It's a pretty intense 4 days. And what happens is the week before the Train the Trainer class you've signed up for, or T3 as we like to shorten it to, you'll get an email from your Apple Mentor trainer. It might be myself, it might be Lucas, it might be Ali, and you'll have your assigned teachbacks for the week. You'll get at least 3, and it'll be your job then to go study and prepare those lessons because you're going to be expected to teach them back to your Apple Mentor trainer over WebEx WebEx, or Zoom, over WebEx, and to your fellow trainers. So there's usually anywhere up to 10 people on your Train the Trainer class. Any more than that, it gets a bit unwieldy. And you'll be expected to present back your lesson. You'll present back your first lesson. Then another trainer will go and present their lesson, which will probably be a different lesson from Developing Swift Fundamentals. And you'll be expected to give feedback, ask questions, think of yourself as your students would be sitting in that same kind of class. What kind of questions are they going to have? It's a really nice opportunity to get some feedback on our teaching style and also just test our knowledge and figure out, okay, well, if I get a question that's way out of left field, how am I going to handle that? Your Apple Mentor trainer there is to help you. We're not trying to catch anybody out. We're not trying to say, aha, you don't know enough about Swift. Go to the back of the line. Our goal is to make sure that you just know the material really well and that you're presenting it properly, right? We have to be very specific when we're coding to make sure that the machine does what we want it to do. So when we're teaching the language, we need to make sure that we're giving students the right information. So that's what the Apple Mentor trainer is there to do. We're always open to getting emails or messages from trainers during the course of the week if they have any questions about how they're planning on presenting a lesson. And we'll talk about how you present the lesson, and we'll give you some tips for that next week when we do our second end user prep session. So after you've presented your 3 teachbacks and you've gotten feedback from your Apple Mentor trainer and from your peers, you'll also probably talk about a lab. We often assign labs from each of the lessons in the book. So you'll just talk through how you might implement that in class. There's some really good exercises that you can run with your students in a classroom to make sure that they understand, okay, how do we use auto layout? How do we use segues and navigation controllers? How do we successfully take our idea and turn it into an app that lives on someone's phone? We'll have a little group discussion on that last day. We usually have a group discussion about teaching Swift in a classroom. So if you're already doing that, you might have a chance to present, hey, this is what we're doing at our institution. And it's also a great place to get ideas for how to implement in your own institution. Oftentimes, Brenda will organize a special speaker from Apple. So maybe somebody from developer relations or a systems engineer to talk to us about the hot new technology, or maybe what's coming down the pipeline. At the end of that week, you have a peer evaluation file that you've been filling out the whole time on all your fellow trainers. Just comments about their lessons, what they did well, what they could have done better. You'll email that back to your Apple Mentor trainer. They'll go write up an evaluation report for every single person in the class. And if the Apple Mentor trainer says, yes, you know what, this person has done an amazing job, they've successfully showed that they understand the material, it can present it well, that's when you become a certified trainer in app development with Swift. It's a fairly intense week and it does require a good chunk of your time. So that's why we want to make sure that you're prepared by giving some homework and giving you some tips on how to best succeed in that train the trainer class. Because we understand that's a huge commitment to make 4 days out of the week, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. Irish time. Now, are there any questions about that whole flow and what's expected of you at each stage? And if you think of a question later as I'm going through the material, that's cool. Just drop a note in the chat, or we can all kind of unmute and have a chat at the very end of today. Okay, cool. So let's talk about the actual material that we're going to be working with. This is the main book that we're focused on. I'll talk about some of the others in the curriculum because there's a whole suite of material that we could draw from as educators when we're teaching people how to code. But this is the one that we're focused on for getting certified in app development with Swift. So these are 2 books available for free from the bookstore. I've just pasted 2 links into the chat that'll take you right to the material in the bookstore. Now, if it's not available in your country for whatever reason, because I think there were a few countries where it wasn't available, and I'm not sure why, I'm going to show you a different way to access the material a little bit later. And in fact, you're going to be encouraged to sign up to this course, which is all the same material that's in the book, because we also have quizzes that we can assign and the labs are mentioned there as well. And it's all exactly the same material as appears in these books. Okay, so the course itself, that Develop in Swift Fundamentals book, is designed as a course that you can teach. And it's designed to take 1 semester with university level students, or around 180 hours. Now, that sounds like a lot. And that's just a prescription for the book. You can teach it in a boot camp course that just lasts a week or 2 weeks or 3. There's lots of different ways to teach this, and Apple's not saying you have to teach it over the course of a semester. They're just saying, hey, this is one recommended way to do it. It was kind of designed to be a course that would be taken over the course of a semester. The 180 hours is also going to depend on the coding level of experience of your students. If you've got master's students in computer science, they should be able to fly through this much quicker. It's also going to depend whether or not you work on the projects in class or you assign them as homework and they work on them outside of class. The course features 33 lessons over 3 units, and each lesson is designed to teach a specific skill related to either Swift, the programming language itself, or app development. At the end of each of the units, there is a guided project that walks you through how you're going to actually use some of the concepts that you learned in that unit to build an actual working app. One of my favorite things about these projects is that they give a bit of freedom for students to get creative. They can take the brief that's inside the guided project and say, okay, cool. Well, this is an apple pie word guessing game. I want to make it a little bit different. I want to add my own words. I want to add my own metaphor. Instead of an apple tree and apples, I'll use some other way of showing how far along you've progressed in the game. I also really love these projects because it gives students a chance to experience what it's like to be a developer in a real professional development environment. We get to collaborate with others. We get to work through projects and figure out if we've hit all the features and we've successfully built the thing we're supposed to build. It's a really good chance to exercise our skills. So let's talk about Swift very briefly. Now, who's just a quick yes or no? Who's written any Swift code? Just a quick Y or N in the chat if you have or haven't. Very cool. All right, quite a few Ys. One no, that's cool. So Swift is Apple's open source programming language for writing iOS apps. And the Swift lessons cover the programming language, its fundamentals, and language features. And I love to point out the fact that it is an open source programming language so that you're not locked into just the Apple platform. There's a Windows implementation, there's Linux. You can run Swift code on AWS if that's the direction your institution goes towards. So there's loads of places you can write this code. You're not just stuck on Apple platforms. And as a language, it has 3 overriding goals. They designed it, it's relatively new, so they got to kind of design it with some major principles in mind, and they had 3 of them. They wanted to make it easier to write safe programs, which is programs with less bugs, common bugs that we would often run into when we're programmers, and things that we always hit and go, oh man, if only there was just some way to just shortcut through a lot of these. So Swift was designed to be a safe language. It was designed to be fast. You know, a lot of this code is running on phones and embedded devices, maybe on your Apple Watch or your Apple TV. So it's got to be an efficient language. And it was also designed to be an expressive language so that it's an easily approachable language for beginners and advanced coders alike. We look at the code on the screen, and even if we don't know any Swift at all, if we take a couple of seconds to read through that code, we could probably guess what's going on there. And we'd have a good idea of, okay, cool. We've got this default score, player 1 score. Looks like we've got a game that somebody's writing some code for. And we're just printing out the score. We're assigning a new value to the score. It's pretty readable as a language. In the App SDK lessons, we cover things like which user interface elements are right for your app. How to use them, as well as app development techniques. So things like patterns, development process, things like code review are mentioned, especially in the teacher guide. And then we put these concepts into practice through those series of 3 projects at the end of each of the units. This sets us up really well to be able to build our own app by the time we're done with developing Swift fundamentals. We spend a lot of time in the App SDK lessons thinking about design from a coding perspective as well, not just from a visual perspective. So we think about things like, how is a user going to interact with my app? What's going to feel most natural for them? And there's a lot of great advice gathered from years and years of building apps that surprise and delight users. So you can't get much better advice than things like the human interface guidelines on developer.apple.com. And there's a whole lesson, building simple workflows, that goes deeply into the human interface guidelines and gives you a kind of highlight tour of some of the elements in that guide. Now, it's not just the material. So there's the book that you can read through and learn all about Swift and the App SDK, as well as some design principles also learned from years and years of building software. There are other resources inside the book as well. And I'm going to show you those in just a second, but there's a link off to student materials and teacher materials. And of course, next week is when we talk about the teacher materials. But inside the student materials, we have labs that we can assign to our students to have them to complete. They're already written for us. We don't have to write any of the instructions or any of the code. We can actually check it because we've got teacher solutions and the teacher resources. So this is huge because I don't have to go debug example code that I want my students to run. I can just hand them the lab and say, go do the labs. They're exactly aligned to the book and the lesson that we just went through. So that'll take you through exactly what you need to know and what you should be practicing to get a really good handle on strings or functions or structures or whatever element we're learning about that week. Inside the teacher resources, again, that we'll see next week, there are keynote slides that we use during the Train the Trainer week and that we can use to present this material in the classroom. And it's perfectly aligned to the story that's told in the lesson. And it does a really good job of driving home, hey, why am I learning about strings? Why am I learning about the has prefix method on a string? Well, you're learning about it because that might be something maybe we're processing user input and we want to see what kind of question someone's asking. Is it a how, what, where, why question? How are we going to react differently to that? That's where we can use the has prefix method on a string. So there's lots of stuff here and example projects that are completed already. So they're finished versions of the guided projects. So that if you want to show students where they're going to wind up at the end of a guided project, you can actually open up a pre-built one. You don't have to build it yourself. And you can show them, hey, this is what the apple pie game is going to look like when we're done. All right, so let's go take a look. Let's have a quick tour of the materials. So as I mentioned, it's in the books application. That's available on your Mac, on your iPad, on your iPhone. So you can read this on the go if you want. And like I said, I'll show you a different way to get to this material when we're done here. I'll show you a way to get to it if you just have a web browser and maybe you're on some other device. So you can just search on the bookstore. You can go to that link that I sent you, or you can search on the bookstore for Develop in Swift. I'm going to search for Develop in Swift Fundamentals. Helps if I spell it right. And we can see that here it is in the store. You'll see multiple instances in the store. And the one that we want is the Xcode 13 edition. Now, they will be updating that to Xcode 14. They usually take a little bit longer once Xcode 14 or the latest version of Xcode comes out. They take a little while, and they just update the screenshots more often than not. And maybe they update in data collections, for example, that I'll talk about in a second. They've updated some of the material to use new async patterns. So it's available for free. This button should say get for you or download. I've already gotten it, so I just have a read button. So if I hit read, up pops the book for me. I can go to the table of contents here and check it out and swipe through. In the introduction, you'll find a lot of the same information I just walked you through. So things like the fact that there are 33 lessons in the book. The fact that we focus on the two main ones, Swift and app development, but there are also some excellent app design lessons now at the start and finish of every single one of the units. It talks a little bit more about the guided projects. I mentioned Apple Pie, but there are two others as well. And it also talks about the pathway. And I'll mention some of these other ones and provide some links as we go. Maybe your students have no idea what coding is and they're starting from absolute zero. You might want to go with Develop in Swift Explorations. That's much less lecture-based and more hands-on. Students work a lot through Xcode playgrounds that I'm going to show you in a second. And it's a really nice, gentle introduction to code. You won't be building full apps by the time you're done with Explorations, but you'll get a long way to understanding what coding is. With Develop in Swift Fundamentals, that's this book here. That's the one we're focused on. It mentions up at the top that it takes around 1 semester for this. And by the end of this, you will be able to build your own apps from scratch. Data collections is a follow-on. So once students are done with fundamentals and they're like, oh, I'm dying to learn more about iOS development, learn some more patterns, maybe learn about protocols and how I can apply those to my code, data collections is your next stop. By the time you're done with data collections, you'll have a rich portfolio of apps that you've built, and you'd be well ready to step into a junior developer role in any company. When we're teaching this, we don't necessarily have to follow it from start to finish. You can if you want. But with that one, you can kind of pick and choose a little bit and jump around. If you're not using UIKit, because all of these books are focused on UIKit still, because it's still an important user interface framework. If you're not using those tables, if you're using Swift UI for that kind of stuff, you can jump right to working with the web and learn about how you can natively decode and encode JSON in your app, how you can fetch data from over the web. We build a NASA photo of the day app. There's lots of good stuff in data collections. My favorite thing about the fact that we have these 3 set of books is that even if I'm just teaching Develop in Swift fundamentals, there's lots of material I can steal from explorations and data collections to teach in the class and get students extra practice. For example, I love going back to Develop in Swift explorations and taking the question bot project and having some of my fundamental students do that, because it's such a fun, engaging project for them to build. And then we have advice on how to set up our learning environment, as well as a link to the student materials. And I'm going to show you those in just a second. But if you want, you can download them yourselves, because you are going to want to work through these for your homework. Now, it has a note about the App Design Workbook. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it is an amazing resource. And it's a guide to help you structure how you're going to successfully ship an app. Like I said, it's built on a lot of experience that we had at Apple. In every single team that I worked on, we followed these principles. They weren't necessarily written down in a Keynote file like they are now, but we followed every single one of these steps to make sure that what we were building actually got shipped to customers. Okay, and then we get into our first unit. So it gives us a bit of an overview of the lesson, our Swift lessons and our SDK lessons. As I mentioned, at the start of every single one of the units, we have an app design lesson. And this is not part of the homework. You don't have to read these necessarily. They're great guides, and it's really interesting content. But if you're pressed for time, you can actually kind of skip over these. And then we get into the Swift lessons. We've got some vocabulary so that we get everybody on the same page. It jumps us to the glossary, and then we just get done to go back to the book. It has related resources. And I highly recommend, if you get assigned a lesson like Introduction to Swift and Playgrounds, I highly recommend that you read the related resources, just so that you have the background information, because it goes into a lot more depth about that particular lesson. And then it's like any other programming text. We have a bunch of info about the history of Swift, where it's coming from, why it's a modern language. We have a huge emphasis on safety, which you're going to see again and again throughout the book. We have links off to the open source projects here, and even more of Swift has been open source as we've been going. And of course, we have our Hello World exercise. So there are things that the students can do themselves as they're reading along, and open up a terminal window and try working through some of these exercises. If you're reading this on an iPad or a phone, this is kind of handy, because we get a first look at Xcode. Now, that's not super useful because it's not very big. But this is useful because Xcode is a professional development environment, and there's lots going on in the user interface. So we have all these callouts here that'll highlight certain areas that we should focus on, which is really important to prevent our students from getting lost, and ourselves. We know where to look when we're looking for the debug console area, and then the results sidebar in the playgrounds. Now you'll hear playgrounds mentioned throughout this. It doesn't refer to Swift playgrounds, which run on an iPad and a Mac as well, but they're primarily for the iPad. Xcode playgrounds are a slightly different beast and super useful to use as a teaching tool. And I'm going to show you those in a second when I look at the student materials. There's some more screenshots. Again, really useful for getting students to look around where they're going to focus in Xcode when they get to a Mac. And we even walk you through the steps for, okay, how are we going to create a new playground? How are we going to write our very first lines of Swift code? Now, at the end, we have a quiz. That is going to be part of the homework, to go through all these quizzes. Now, there's a way to submit them on Canvas. I'm not going to check them. I'm not going to grade anybody. Nobody gets failed if they get the quizzes wrong. It's just to show you some of the questions that your students should be able to answer by the time they're done with this particular lesson, just to check their understanding. You also have a call out to the labs here. So the introduction .playground. So we're going to take a look at one of those in just a second. But we have these quizzes that we can kind of go through, figure out which of these features of Swift make it a safe language. Well, type safety, type inference, error handling, and optionals. It would be all of them. So a really good way to check your understanding of how well you read through that lesson. And then we're on to the next. We're on to constants, variables, and data types. Again, a bit more vocabulary, because now we start to get a bit deeper. We're out of the introduction now. Now we're getting to learn some of the nuts and bolts of Swift. We have a link off to the Swift programming language guide. Again, I can't recommend that highly enough. There's so much good information in there. And by going to it from these lessons, you get a bit of context. So instead of being lost in this massive book, you can get focused on saying, oh, okay, cool. I'm focused on constants and variables. I've just learned about those in this lesson. Now I can learn some of the nuances of that particular language feature. Again, more explanations, some sample code. We do some modeling here where we try to challenge our students to figure out, do you use a constant or a variable? Because we have those two different constructs in Swift. We talk about some of the rules you follow. And then we talk about starting to organize it even more, not just from a, hey, is this data going to change or not, but maybe how do we start to group data together? And then again, we get to the very end. We have a lab. And we have a connection to the app design workbook. We don't have to worry about that bit too much, but it is a useful exercise. And again, we have the same review questions at the end. In the guide, we also have our guided project where it walks us through the project. Now, that is not part of your homework. You're not expected to complete all of these guided projects, but it's definitely useful having a read through just to see how they work through the development of this particular app. This is the simple one to start out with, the Light app. And it gives us things to think about when we're building our apps as well. So we have lots of different parts that we can work through either in class or outside of class. And then we're on to the next unit. And we can scroll through the table of contents either here or scroll through the pages here. We'll see each lesson has got that kind of highlighted banner. So let's take a look at the student material. So if I just finished constants, variables, and data types, I now have to go do the constants, variables, playground. So I have the student materials here. I'm going to open that up. We have 4 folders. And I'm going to go into Unit 1, Getting Started. Inside Other Resources, that's where we do have the App Design Workbook. Again, super useful resource, but we're not going to go into that now. And the companion piece, this Go Green prototype. So in Getting Started, we have a few, not all of the lessons, but the lessons that we have labs for. I'm going to open up constants, variables, and data types. And I have one file in here, this playground. So if I double click that, it's going to open it up in Xcode. And this is my very first experience opening up the professional development environment that I'm going to be working with if I'm building iOS apps. And the beautiful thing about this is I, as a teacher, haven't had to write any of this. This is all pre-written for me. I mean, I could author these myself, and I've got videos, I think, that I send links to. I'll send you links to all the things that I mentioned in the talk today. But you can author these yourself. But it says here, declare a constant called friends. Okay, so if I've read through the lesson, I know that I use the let keyword to create a constant called friends, and I'm going to assign it a value of, let's be generous and say 500. And then it tells me to print out the value by referencing my constant. Okay, maybe a bit technical there, but we'll start typing in print. The thing I love about using Xcode Playgrounds here is that we get the full power of Xcode and it's autocomplete. Now that can be a bit intimidating for beginners. Some of this stuff you go, what on earth is that doing? But I know that actually this is the one I want, print, and I'm just going to print out friends. It's going to autocomplete for me. Huge help because I don't want to have to mistype these things. And we can see already, as I typed, I haven't hit any other keys. I haven't hit a play button or anything like that down here. I can see already over in the sidebar what's being evaluated on each line of Swift code that I've written. We can see here I'm storing the value 500 in this friends constant. And then when I print out friends, you can see that it looks a little bit different because it's formatting it for the console. And in fact, I can see that it shows up down here in the console area that pops up when I do print something out. Then it asks us to go and try to change the number of friends. Now, if you're familiar with how constants and variables work, this is a constant. We shouldn't be able to assign it a new value. Maybe I've lost a lot of friends. And I can see down here, I've got an error in my console, and I've also got an error here that I can actually, Xcode is going to help me try to fix it. And there's a really great lesson in Unit 1 called Building, Running, and Debugging an App that'll explain to you what these different symbols mean and also give you some advice on when to take advantage of this handy fix button and when it's not going to work that well. Then we have another page, and this is important to emphasize with your students. I have students all the time who complete one page and then they're like, cool, I'm done. We got to emphasize that there are multiple pages to this exercise. And in fact, if you want to see all of them, you can go up to this breadcrumb bar here and you'll see that we have a lot of exercises to work through for our constants, variables, and data types lesson. And again, I haven't had to write any of this, and it all follows the book's table of contents to the letter. It's a perfect progression that follows the lesson. So students can even read a bit of the lesson, go try some of the lab. When they get to a point where they're like, don't know what's going on, they can go back to the book, read the next section, and say, okay, cool. Let me go back to my playground and work through it again. This is an amazing tool to be able to use, and I love the instant feedback that we get. Now, if you're not seeing that, it might be because you don't have it set to automatically run. We can just tap on this little caret down here and choose automatically run or manually run. When we choose manually run, we can even say, you know what, only run my code up to a certain line. When we hover over the line number gutter, we'll have a little play button so we can play our code to that stage in the file. So it's super useful. If you don't want that automatic feedback, you can actually turn it to manually run. So that's going to be part of the homework. We're going to ask that you go through as many of these labs as is humanly possible. There are a lot, and I understand that people have to do things like eat and sleep and maybe teach class and pay attention to friends and family and loved ones and pets. It is a lot of work to go through, but we are going to ask that you go through as much of this as you can. So that's the student materials. We'll talk more about the teacher materials when we rejoin next week. All right, so that's Develop in Swift fundamentals. That's what we're going to be focused on, laser focused for that Train the Trainer week. Like I said, once you're done with that and you've gotten your students through fundamentals and they've shown that, oh, actually we're kind of cooking now. We've got it as far as Swift development goes. The next step is Develop in Swift data collections. And that's a great resource to pick and choose from. Go into unit 2 and look at working with the web. Or maybe jump to unit 3 and look at things like you'll learn about generics and about collection views. In unit 1, we learn about protocols. So if you look at the Swift lessons in each of the units, you've got some great new concepts to work with. And they'll also help you read open source code that's out there written in Swift. And you'll say, oh, okay, now I understand what's going on here with protocols. And if you are teaching something like Swift UI, or if you're interested in it, even though we don't go into it in these books, all the Swift lessons provide a great base for how I'm going to learn about Swift UI. Because when we go over things like generics and functions and structures, that's all the key underpinnings of how Swift UI is built. So we'll have a great understanding of, okay, I know exactly what's going on. And I know when I go look at the Swift UI code, I know exactly what it's doing here. So developing Swift data collections is for those students who are a bit more advanced and ready to go further. And as I mentioned, there's a really great set of resources for students who maybe aren't ready for that jump. They don't want to be professional developers. Maybe they're project managers who want to learn a bit about code so that they can talk a little bit more intelligibly with engineers. Develop in Swift Explorations and the APCS Principles version. That's just the same material packaged for the advanced placement market in the US, where you can get college credits for taking high school classes. So it aligns to certain standards that they need to hit. But it's pretty much the same material. That's just going to take a little bit more holistic view of app development, take a little bit of a step back, and also just explain things a little bit more simply. So if students are struggling to understand some of the concepts in Develop in Swift Fundamentals, and maybe some of the language is a bit too technical for them, you can always jump into Develop in Swift Explorations to find something that might connect with them. Now, if you are interested in teaching that, Apple has provided an amazing resource for free, where you can go and jump onto Canvas, get a free account. And this is a professional learning course that walks you through Develop in Swift Explorations. There are videos that explain the different concepts. So if your students are stuck, there's a really good way to explain what a constant and a variable is and why we have the two. And there are some really well done videos that walk us through some of the guided projects. So in each unit in Develop in Swift Explorations, there's a build section where students get some hands-on work, either building a question bot or building a photo frame app or building a chat bot. There's lots of stuff they build, and there are videos for every single one of the projects, including a rock, paper, scissors game that are great to add to any programming course you're running. So that's the other material. That's stuff we're not so much worried about for Train the Trainer class. We are super focused on Develop in Swift Fundamentals for a Train the Trainer class. So if that's your goal, is to get certified, we can kind of ignore all that other stuff for now, data collections and explorations and this course, and really just focus on the materials. So as I mentioned, the student guide, that's the one that we're focused on for this week. So we're going to go through your homework in a second, but this is the book that you should go download. And if you can't get it from the bookstore, I will show you when we talk about the homework exactly how you can get access to it and how you'll be able to read the material yourself. Next week, we're going to come back and talk about that teacher guide a bit more. Oops, and I missed. All right, so the homework. The homework for next week, or for definitely before you come to a Train the Trainer class, is number one and above everything else. If you skip all the other bits of homework, you should 100% read Develop in Swift Fundamentals. That's going to be a key because that does a really good job of telling why. Next week, you're going to hear me say again and again, I want to hear why. Why are we teaching you this concept? Why are we talking about functions? Why are we talking about specific functions? Or why are we talking about features of structures? What does that matter to us? All that stuff is in the material in Developing Swift Fundamentals. So that's the number one piece of homework. The second bit of homework is take the quizzes at the end of each lesson. You can either do it in the book or on the Canvas course that I'm going to show you in just a second. That's just to check yourself to say, okay, cool, I understand what went on in that lesson, and I can kind of talk intelligently about that particular feature. The third piece of homework is complete the labs. Now, as I mentioned, I know that you have other things to do like eat and sleep. So just complete as many of the labs as is humanly possible. Go through a few pages in each lesson if you can, just to get an idea for, okay, I see what we're trying to exercise here and I see what the important parts are. So that's the homework. That's the big takeaway from today. Now, as I mentioned, and I kept promising, if you don't have access to the books or you want to read it just online in a web browser for some reason, you are going to go sign up for this class here. And in fact, even if you have the book, I would prefer it if you signed up for this course here. So that first link, canvas.instructure.com, you can create a free account. Again, it's going to give you a bunch of assignments on the very first page. Those are all the quizzes from the book. And you're going to go through those, answer the quizzes as best you can. It's going to auto grade them, but I promise you, I don't check them. No one has ever been restricted from entering a T3 because they got a 0 or a very low score. It's really just to show you some of the tools that Apple's provided that you can actually use in your own classroom, because the material that we're using on Canvas here, you can download as a common cartridge download if you're familiar with that kind of thing, and you can install it in your own learning management system that supports Common Cartridge. So that's one way to do the second bit of homework and the first bit of homework, read the book and take the quizzes. An alternative way to complete the labs, because you're going to complete the labs, you won't send them to me. If you want to see a more interactive way to do it, there is a copy of the labs up here on GitHub. And on that page, there's a set of instructions on how you would assign these, how you'd use this in a classroom. And you're more than welcome to follow the instructions. And if you're familiar with GitHub, it might seem kind of natural. I like using this method because it gets students ready for what they're going to see in a real world development shop. We use GitHub and source control all the time. It uses pull requests. So we can kind of see the difference of code you added versus the code that was already there or code you removed. And I really like walking through these pull requests with students and having them explain, okay, this is why I did this. This is why I did this. And so all the labs are available in that GitHub repository. There's some automated workflow checking where it'll kind of check the whole repository out and build it when you do submit a pull request, which is just a way to kind of make your life a bit easier as an educator to make sure that there's no obvious compilation errors straight out of the box, and just do some kind of rudimentary checking. So that's an alternative way to do the homework. So reading it and taking the quizzes on the Canvas course and then doing the labs via this GitHub process. Now, when you're studying and getting ready for the Train the Trainer course, there's also plenty of supplemental material out there. The related links, of course, in the book all point to this docs.swift.org/swiftbook. Really useful material to read through. And of course, there's loads of documentation on developer.apple.com that you can check out to help supplement your lesson. We're going to talk next week about the actual delivery of the lessons. And of course, we don't want to put all of that material in the lessons. It's a bit like a research for a novel. We want to keep a lot of that backstory out of the novel explicitly, but we can sort of tell that it's underneath the surface. These are also great resources to point your students at if they do have questions, or if they ask a question that you're like, actually, I don't know the answer to that. Let's go have a look. That Swift book is going to be a great first start. Now, in terms of answering questions, there's also another GitHub repository that I've kind of collected over the years, all the years I've been doing this. There was in person or online. This app dev resources contains Xcode playgrounds, Swift playgrounds, and lots of links to the other resources, whether it's server-side Swift and how we might implement that kind of stuff. It's links to design resources. And inside the Xcode playgrounds, there's lots of examples of student questions that have come up or teacher questions that have come up during the course of one of these courses that we've written some sample code for. Or we've taken the code that's in the slides and we've implemented it in an Xcode playground so that your students can play around with it after they see it in your lecture. So that's all the material you can ever read through. Again, I understand that people have lives and that this is not the only thing you're focused on, probably, right? Next week, we're going to rejoin and we're going to talk about the teacher guide, which you can get to from this link. Again, I'll send all these links out to you in an email after today. And if you have any questions before next week's session about the material, or if you get stuck on the labs or stuck on the quizzes, feel free to shoot me an email. Of course, you'll have that when I drop you an email a little bit later today. You can also join the Teaching Swift Slack if you're into Slack. That's just a free instance that I set up where a bunch of educators from the same process you're going through have joined. If they've had questions, if they've found bugs, I know one of our educators found a bug in the Apple Pie code in the latest version of Xcode, and he's offered a good way to work around it. So there's lots of good information on there and loads of experienced educators who've gone through this process and have become certified. So it's a great place to reach out. You can also direct message me on there if you do have any questions about any of the material or where to get it. All right, so that's what is up for next week. We've got 3 bits of homework assigned. I am going to stop sharing my screen and come off of everything. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop a note. We're going to close that so I can see the chat. Any questions about any of that stuff? And you can either go on the microphone and ask, or you can drop a note in the chat. It's up to you. I'm a huge fan of this material. I think it gives us such a big leg up, especially when you're preparing for that next semester's set of classes. It's fantastic. We're going to see some really fun stuff in the teacher guide that make it even easier when you're rolling into class that day and ready to teach a lesson. And it'll help you out a lot when we get to your Train the Trainer class. And you are expected to be able to share your screen over WebEx. You're going to present Keynote slides, so make sure you practice with Keynote a bit. And you're going to probably demonstrate some capabilities of Xcode, especially when you're teaching your app SDK lesson. Because usually what you get is 2 Swift lessons and 1 app SDK lesson. Great question. So do we have to do the test straight after our next meeting? So 2 things. Nope, you don't have to do it straight after. And it's not really a test. There's no exam at the end of the week. You get evaluated by the Apple Mentor Trainer, and we'll write up an evaluation report, and it'll have all your peer feedback from the week, and it'll have notes from your Apple Mentor Trainer on what you did well, what you can work on, what to remember when you're teaching these certain things. And then a note about whether you've successfully passed. It's not really pass or fail, but if you've become certified as a trainer in app development with Swift, or if you need to come back. If you enter the week and you find that, oh man, I'm really shaky, I haven't read through this stuff enough, I don't know it well enough, that's not the end of the road. We don't say, that's it, you failed, you'll never become a certified trainer. Oftentimes people need to just come back, for an hour and a half review session. You'll meet with an Apple Mentor trainer one-on-one and present a couple of lessons that you've had more time to prepare for. And you get to have a bit more of a dialogue with the Apple Mentor trainer and get some advice on how to present the material. In the very rare occasion, if you're not prepared at all, maybe you didn't read the book at all, and you just rocked up hoping to pass, you might be asked to attend another Train the Trainer class, so another 4 days. But that's not happened very often. Hopefully that answers your question. So you don't have to, once we've finished the end user prep sessions, you can say, I need to take a few months to get ready, and I'll join the T3 in March. Great. Any other questions? Okay, brief explanation of the difference between Swift, SwiftUI, Xcode, Xcode Playgrounds, and Swift Playgrounds. That is a lot. So of course, Swift is the core language that we're using to write our iOS apps. That's where we're learning about things like you'd learn in any other language like Java or Python or Objective-C, for example. We're going to learn about functions, classes, structures, enumerations, lots of different things in Swift. Now we've got two different user interface frameworks that we can use. There's the older one called UIKit, which is based on an even older one called AppKit that came from the Next era. And this is all class-based. So if you're familiar with the difference between classes and structures, this is class-based in UIKit. If you're not familiar with the difference, you'll learn all about it when you get to the structures and classes lessons in the book. And it's just a slightly more old school maybe way of writing user interface. We use a thing called Interface Builder to build out our UI. And this new hotness is called SwiftUI. It's a slightly more declarative UI language. There is a preview pane that we have so we can kind of see what we're building as we're writing the code. And there are loads of tutorials. If you go to developer.apple.com/tutorials, there are a ton of tutorials on how to write SwiftUI apps. So if your students are taking Developing Swift Fundamentals, they'll learn one way of building an app, and they'll learn all the fundamentals that are important to whatever kind of app they're going to build, UIKit or SwiftUI. Now, in this course, we use Xcode exclusively to build our apps. There is a new app, and in fact, I have the app here. It's called Playgrounds. This is available on the Mac now, thanks to Catalyst technology. It's also available primarily on the iPad, was the first platform it was written for. This is now a fully featured development environment itself as well. We can start a new app from scratch. Now, when we're building an app in Swift Playgrounds, which is different than Xcode Playgrounds, we are only going to be building it in SwiftUI, really. There's a way to build it in a UIKit-based app, but out of the box, we get a SwiftUI app. And we can see how we're building our user interface, and it's represented over here. This is our preview of the UI that we're building over here. So this is an example of SwiftUI, and it helps if I'm sharing my screen to show that. Sorry, apologies. This is the Playgrounds app on the desktop. Here, I'll show you the main look here. This is what you would also see if you were on an iPad. I created a new app by hitting this plus button and added it here, and it just added some sample code. And instead of hello end user prep session, I can say hello world. And we can see that the changes I'm making in code are immediately reflected over here in my app preview. And there are lots of tutorials inside Playgrounds here that will help us learn a little bit about how to build an app and even how to get started with machine learning. So that's Swift Playgrounds. Xcode Playgrounds are a whole different beast because we're using Xcode, the actual app that professional developers use. And this is where, if I open that back up again, this is where we see our code executed line by line. So if I say something like, let my goal steps equal to 10,000, set that to manually, so I'm gonna have it automatically run. So as I'm writing my code, I can see it reflected over here, which is a great tool for beginners. And then also from Xcode, I can also say, hey, you know what? I'm gonna create a new project, not just a playground. I'm gonna create a new project. And this is where I can build apps myself, especially when I'm following along with developing Swift fundamentals. I can also build the new style of project, a Swift Playgrounds app that I can also work on my iPad. Cool. So loads of tools for us to write code and get our students writing code. All right. Well, look, you have my email. I'll be sending you an email shortly about all the stuff that we talked about today. You have the link to the Slack instance. If you don't, again, I'll be sending a link to it in the email. Feel free to shoot me any questions you might have before you join the second end user prep session. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Bye, everyone.